Hi everybody. Today I'm going to talk about two books. I've done this one other time where I do a double book review because of the thematic kind of overlap of the books in question. And these two books both came out from Baker Academic over the past few months. This is late 2025 as I'm recording this. And they are both very different in some ways, but also in broad strokes about very, very, very similar ideas. And so I thought they would be really fun to do kind of in conversation with each other in a form of a double review. So what I'll do is I'll follow my typical format of my reviews in that I'll summarize the main idea of each title. I'll comment on the research behind each project, the readability of the style, and then just my reaction thoughts at the end. And I'll kind of try to bounce back and forth between each title as I move through those topics. And I hope that you get a sense of, ultimately I love both these books and I want to encourage people to read them both, but hopefully you'll get a sense of if one of them might be more helpful to you at the moment or not as I talk through that. So they're both fantastic. I'm just going to say that up at the front. I'll give more reasons why as I go through this. But yeah, let's jump into this format. Before I do that quickly, I just want to note that I've been having a lot of fun getting my Patreon community up and running. We've done a couple of these online monthly book clubs, and it's been great to get to know people in that format. And so our next reading together is a chunky one. We're going to read The Scandal of Leadership by J.R. Woodward together in December. That's going to be our next selection. So if you want to get more connected to me, either through that book club or just get my monthly Runtime Reading newsletters and generally be more kind of connected to me and some of the communication that I give through Patreon, please check out that link below. Would love to have anyone sign up who's interested in that. Okay, let's jump into the review. So first, Understanding Biblical Law by Dru Johnson. The main idea of this title is to encourage, particularly I think he has Protestant evangelicals in mind as an audience for this, but in general to encourage anyone to rethink how we approach the law scripturally, because the ways that we tend to think about the law or law in a Western context are not how the Scripture thinks of law or how the Scripture presents law. And so his main thrust in this project, I would say, is to push back on the metaphor of breaking the law and encourage a new metaphor of keeping the law. And so he's very much, I'll talk more about this in the research, but he's very much in conversation with kind of the Lakoff and Johnson metaphors we live by kind of approach to knowledge, which I think is right on the money. And his one of his big arguments in the book is that if you grow up in, especially in a Western context, your conception, the way you think about law is very rigid and static, and involves breaking rules or not breaking rules. Whereas the Hebraic approach, ancient Israel's approach towards God's law, was not about rigidity or breaking, but was actually more about cultivating and keeping, like you would something like a garden or a pet. Something that you're kind of responsible for tending to. And instead of breaking that, you can transgress it. You can kind of work against keeping it appropriately, and that's not good. But it's not the same as breaking a law. That's a static thing that you're supposed to find the thing that you're not supposed to break and just not do that. That's not the way the biblical writers are conceptualizing of God's law. In fact, one way to think about law or Torah is instruction. It's more of a dynamic, lively process. And then that speaks to the psalmist saying, giving praise to God's law and meditating on it and chewing on it and thinking about it and dwelling in it, and that being a good thing and a source of life. And so that's his main, I would say that's the main plank of his argument, is to help wind back some of the ways we think about law and then replace it with something that's more genuinely biblical and ancient. And what he does then is he gives you more so is endeavoring to give you tools to do that with the scriptures, as opposed to just telling you what to think then. That would be a little bit ironic given the kind of thrust of the project to just tell you what to think. He's actually more trying to equip you to read Torah and to interact with Torah and do what the psalmist says, to meditate on it and to chew on it and to think about what this means for a life well lived in the way that God would have it be lived. And so each chapter then goes through proposing tools for that very process, and even giving very practical exercises. Here's a reflection exercise. He tells you, go back and read these chapters in Deuteronomy or in Leviticus with these things in mind, and practice thinking along with the law and what this would mean. What would you do? What decisions would you make? It's a much more lively, dynamic, living process than how Westerners tend to think about rigid law. And so, in very broad terms, that is what Dru Johnson is looking to do. And he does some very very creative things with the book that I'll talk about more in the readability section in a minute. But that's what he's trying to accomplish here with understanding biblical law. Now, Paul Sloan's book, Jesus and the Law of Moses, is much more Gospels/New Testament focused than Dru Johnson's project, but it's very resonant with a very similar approach. Namely, what Paul Sloan is doing here is, this is, I would say, much more of an academic project, and his thesis, the broad kind of thrust of his argument, is to situate Jesus, the figure in the Gospels, to situate Jesus as one of many people who are debating how to live according to God's law, according to the law of Moses in the nomenclature of Sloan's project. So, situating Jesus as one of many figures who are having this lively conversation and this lively debate and rhetoric that Dru Johnson is kind of tipping his hat to. If you take Dru Johnson's lens, then what that does is that lends you towards living the law in a way that brings up debate and discussion and questions, cultivating, keeping, intending. And so Sloan is basically saying, hey, Jesus was doing exactly that. And he was one of many figures in a kind of whole matrix of beliefs and understandings of people in the first century that were also all doing that and had all had different ideas about what it meant to be faithful to God's instruction, to God's Torah. And Jesus entered that conversation. Jesus had a claim on that, on how to be faithful to it. And so Jesus was not, it's really important to say in Sloan's argument here, Jesus was not throwing off the law. Jesus was not posing a simplistic binary that many evangelicals are wont to do, which is to say it's not about rules, it's about relationship with God. Jesus was not trying to do that. He was not trying to pit relationship with God against following God's rules, because tending to God's law was to be in relationship with God. Tending to God's law faithfully was to actually preserve that connection to God. And so Jesus was entering that conversation and offering, here's how to do it. Now, of course, in faith, Christians believe that Jesus was doing that as the incarnate one. But the question is, for Paul Sloan's project, is how do the Gospels present Jesus as one in this conversation? And importantly, a big part of his project is to say, what are ways that we commonly, and especially in biblical scholarship, but in the ways that it trickles down very much to evangelical teaching and practice, especially in my world, that's the world I'm in. You know, what are ways that we misunderstand what Jesus was doing, or how the Gospels present what Jesus was doing? And so he gives a few examples. I'll offer a couple here right at the beginning of this review. You know, one of the examples he gives was that many will portray Jewish law as a compassionless, exclusivistic thing. So, you know, it's without compassion for the leper or the bleeding woman, for example, the unclean, the impure. The law ended up perpetrating this exclusivistic, careless system that marginalized people who couldn't, live in the purity. Some will say the law is rigid and compassionless, and Jesus came in with compassion and was therefore transgressing the law by including the leper, by healing them and reincorporating them back in. Sloan's saying that's not a good way to read what Jesus is doing. Or others will say, someone like N.T. Wright is in this camp, will say the law was about nationalism. It was about Israel's identity, which became even more important in that pluralistic world around the Mediterranean and oppressed by the Roman Empire, that it became more important for the Jews to keep that nationalistic identity by doing the works of the law. And so the law became about nationalism in a way. That's an anachronistic label, but that's kind of what people like N.T. Wright will argue happened. And Paul Sloan is saying, nope, Jesus is not saying that either. Jesus is not trying to throw off a nationalism or a nationalistic kind of works of law approach. And also, Jesus is certainly not, another kind of camp is legalism. The Jewish law became about earning salvation, or about earning earning God's good graces, as a nation or as an individual. And so as Jewish law ended up becoming legalistic, Jesus was throwing off legalism and saying, no, it's not about that. You don't need to follow rules to be in a relationship with God. That gets back to that simplistic binary I was talking about a minute ago. And Paul Sloan is saying, no, none of that stuff is actually a good read of what the Gospels are saying, which is that Jesus was actually entering a conversation that was very lively and roiling already in the first century, and he was just offering a way to be faithful to God's law, to the law of Moses, to be faithful to that instruction as you followed him as God's chosen one, as God's Messiah. So Jesus and the law of Moses is kind of a bombshell in a lot of debate on the scholarly level and on the practical level for what it means then to think about the Torah through that Jesus lens in a different way. So that's my attempt to summarize both of these books. They're doing in some ways very different things, but they're also ultimately encouraging kind of a new and revitalized approach to the law, to the same thing. They're both talking about the same thing in that sense, and so that's why I thought they'd be a good kind of conversation partners for this review. All right, let's move a little bit quicker through these next categories because I went way longer than I meant to on those summaries. Okay, back to Dru Johnson's book in terms of the research. So what he's really in conversation with many Jewish sources, but not exclusively. He does interact with Christian sources as well, but he's really trying to. The thrust again of his book is to get back to what is Torah and how do we even think about what Torah is and how it functions in life. And so a lot of his sources go back to that kind of work. And then one thing I really like, I'm flipping to an example right now in the book, but one thing that I like is he does pose further reading resources that I think are really, really helpful. So there's lots in the back of the book, lots of resources that you can turn to that are very clearly cited. So this is an academic book in the sense that it's sourced in academic works, but it's not academic in style, which I'll talk about in the readability section. But it's a lot more about historically how is Torah understood and redefining what that is. That's what he's up to here. Now, research-wise for Paul Sloan's project, this is much more academic in terms of much more conversant with other academic sources, and so when he pushes back on people like N.T. Wright, for example, or Bultmann is a big person that he pushes back on. Marcus Borg is someone who embodies the kind of compassionless, exclusivistic approach that I talked about a minute ago. He cites them all copiously, and when he pushes back on them, it's very clear where in what areas he's pushing back on and how he's doing it, and in my view, it's very fair. He represents views that he's critiquing and sources them and cites them so you can chase them down on your own and wrestle with whether or not you think it's fair. He's also interacting a lot with Scripture directly, namely the Gospels, sources or scenes like when Jesus heals on the Sabbath, or when Jesus' followers pick the heads of grain off the grass on the Sabbath, or when they don't wash their hands or practice fasting and get accused, of those things. He interacts with the biblical text in all of those situations and is conversant with other people that are broadly in his view. He pulls a lot on Andrew Rillera's work, Lamb of the Free, but he also interacts with Matthew Thiessen, Jesus and the Forces of Death, and Paul Fredrickson, and so on and so forth. So very much more like obviously on the surface academic in terms of the interaction and the research that he's bringing into it. But the readability of both books is a little bit different. I would say overall, Dru's book is more readable, and there's one really key thing that sets the readability of his book apart, in my view, and that is that he includes a fictional narrative threaded through the chapters of the book. So the chapters give you tools for thinking through Torah and practice exercises that you can try, which by the way, I did. I don't usually do that stuff. Like when books kind of give you these practical practical exercises, I tend to just, if I'm honest, skim them and think that's interesting and then keep reading because I just want to keep reading. But in this book, I was really intrigued by the ways he was posing, rethinking some stuff. So I actually, for almost all of the chapters, I stopped. I went back and read the scriptures that he pointed to, and I practiced thinking through them the way that he poses. And it's really, dare I say, fun. It's really enjoyable to do that. But sorry, I'm getting a little distracted in my own commenting on the readability here. In addition to those practical things, he also has this little story. It's a very small story. It's not overwrought. It's not overly in-depth, but it's a small story that goes scene by scene through the course of the book that's set in an ancient Israelite village in which there is a death, and the circumstances around the death are mysterious, and the question becomes, how does God's law help this community think through what happened and how to hold the right people accountable for what happened when it's determined what even the circumstance was around this death? And I have to say, it was a really compelling little story. I found myself really interested, and found myself asking questions like, how did this death happen? And what does justice look like in this case? And how would an ancient setting deal with that, adjudicate that? What's going to happen? And I found myself really interested to see where that little narrative would go. And I love that the narrative is just, it's light, it's not trying to do too much. I have read I've read other books that are written by academics that try to incorporate fiction. I'm thinking of the Week in the Life series that was put out by IVP years ago. And those books, I have to say, it was an admirable idea, but the fiction in those books was very, very clumsy in my view. And I was delighted that Dru Johnson's book here, the fiction is not clumsy. It's actually quite compelling, and that's because he's not trying to do too much with it. He's just trying to embody and kind of put life around some of these principles he's discussing. And that makes the readability of this book, it's already quite a readable book without those scenes, but with that narrative, it just kicks it way up to highly readable and highly engaging. And so I just thought it was like major kudos to him for doing that, for incorporating that. Now, shifting over to the readability of Paul Sloan's book, this is less readable in the sense that it is more academic, it's more granular, it's more detailed, it's more in conversation with those other sources I talked about. That said, if you are excited about this topic, as I am, I ripped through the book. I thought it was academic but clear. I would put it on that level. I'm thinking of Andrew Laird's book, Lamb of the Free, because I just mentioned it a little bit ago. It's, I would say, more readable than that book. So if you've read that book, you might have a comparison point for it. Some similar ideas that are going on here, but I would say more readable. It's a bit shorter, and I don't know, just for me, as someone who grew up ensconced in this populistic kind of evangelical culture that tends to approach everything through this, Jesus wants you to just have a relationship with God and throw out the rules. It's not about rules. Rules are legalism. Rules are moralistic. It's not about that at all. Like, get that out of your head. Like, that whole thing, to have someone enter that conversation in a really academic way, but that also is very enlivening, was so exciting for me. So I was just really, really caught up in seeing how Sloan was pushing back on some popular narratives that I've been, aware of over time. And what he does with specific episodes is so fascinating. Like, episodes in the Gospels that I was very familiar with is super, super, super interesting. And I found myself excited to just see more and more conclusions and more things that he would suggest. So the readability is more academic, but not overly heavy, and certainly not opaque. You're not gonna be struggling to understand the points he's making. It's more provocative and will shake up some things, but it's not hard to understand. Okay. All right. Wow, this double review. Oh man, this has gotten way longer than I meant to, but I'm really passionate about this subject. So let's wrap things up with some reaction thoughts here at the end. Okay, I'll take them in the same order. Understanding biblical law. I've already said kind of a lot about what this book is doing and what I think is really creative about it, and so I won't add too many more thoughts here at the end, other than to say I love this book, and I think it is a fantastic intro. I don't think this needs to be, and I think this is more readable than you might think because it's an academic imprint. I think this would be a great book to go through with a small group or with people in your congregation who maybe aren't even big readers, but because it has those like stop and reflect exercises, it's like just an obvious choice for like a group study kind of approach, because you can do those things together. And I love that he is trying to wind back our approach to law in general. And I mentioned this earlier, but he's really working in the matrix of kind of understanding that people like Lakoff and Johnson have pioneered famously in Metaphors We Live By. And so he's really taking that and applying it to now how do we approach Scripture in the scriptural world. And I think that's right on the money. I love that. I think that it's the right way to do it. I think especially in our Western context, it's really helpful to incorporate the imagination and explicitly engage with metaphor, because that is how we live. That is how we understand the world. That's how we make, that's how we approach reality, which that gets into deeply philosophical and epistemological issues that I don't have time for in this review, but I think that he's just in the right stream. I love it. I think it is the right approach. It's a super readable book, and the creative stuff that he threaded through that he didn't need to and yet decided to, just chef's kiss, just on top, so great. I'm going to be absolutely recommending this to people. Now, I love both of these books, so I'm going to go to Paul Sloan's book now, and I love this one too. I'm going to spend a little bit more time commenting on some things that I loved about it. What he does so well in this book, there's a couple key things he does so well, and one of them is that he takes this whole approach to law that Johnson helpfully points us to, but he gives us some examples of what it means practically to approach a cultivating process of the Torah. And so the one example he comes back to over and over again in the book is what happens when multiple laws, rules, instructions from Torah, what happens when multiple ones overlap and you cannot follow both at the same time? What happens when you do that? So an example he goes to over and over in the book is a child is born, a boy is born in Israel and needs to be circumcised on the 8th day. You're also not supposed to do work on the Sabbath. What happens when the 8th day of the boy's life is on the Sabbath? What are you supposed to do? That's a very clear example of when God's instruction as a whole body can conflict within itself. And that point of conflict, that point of tension where these instructions can't both be followed at the same time, is the point at which we are invited to cultivate the Torah, to follow the Torah as instruction. And the debate that flows out of that overlapping kind of matrix there of ideas is the debate that people like the Pharisees were very actively engaged in Jesus' time and in the portrayal of the Gospels. And that is the debate that Jesus himself entered as a teacher of Torah with disciples and followers. And he proposed a way forward in that very debate. I just think that he does a fantastic job making that case and giving examples of it. I'll just point to one more example so this review doesn't get overly long. A lot of what Paul Sloan argues over the course of the book is that much debate happens around the priestly kind of function of the priests in Israel and also the temple itself. And so there's a lot of conflicts that happen over not just Sabbath as time, but also just actions of healing and of work and of sacrifice. How are the priests supposed to not work, quote unquote, on Sabbath when people are bringing sacrifices, and the priests are supposed to be the ones who are handling those things? Well, there must be exceptions made for priests to be able to function as they are, in order to ultimately be faithful to God's law. So maybe it's of an ultimate faithfulness to God's law to let the priests work, quote unquote, on Sabbath, so that the people can bring sacrifices as they're also expected to in the instruction in the Torah. And so all of the kind of tensions and conflicts that come in these overlapping expectations are a lot centered around the priestly role and the temple as the place of God's presence and cultivating that. And what I'm building up to here is that I think Sloan does an awesome job at pointing us to the reality that Jesus resolved a lot of these tensions in the Gospels, as the Gospels portray him resolving them, because he saw himself as God's presence, as essentially doing the priestly work, but in a mobile way, moving around the ancient world. And so he prioritized this is like the disciples eating the grain on when they weren't supposed to. He resolves that by you see him resolving that by almost prioritizing himself as kind of the high priestly presence at the time, and resolving the hierarchy kind of order of God's instructions as he and his followers almost performing like priestly duties in the temple, which is fascinating to read the Gospels through that lens. And it's not that he is canceling out all the regulations, but he's actually embodying a faithful following of them and inviting other people to do the same thing. And the last thing I'll say, this is going to be a half-hour review. I'm so sorry it went this long. I did not expect it to. I'm just really excited to talk about these books. The last thing I'll say about Sloan's project here that has been sticking with me is his concluding thoughts, and I'll be honest, I am wrestling with them. I'm not sure where to go with them yet, or even if I quite land there or not, but I've been really provoked in reflecting on it. In his concluding thoughts as it relates to Acts 15 and what it then means for Gentiles to follow God's law as Gentiles, I think he does a wonderful job provoking thought on the notion that perhaps followers of Christ are invited to follow the law of Moses, but to follow it as Gentiles. And perhaps that's a lot of what the Acts narrative is actually about. And perhaps Acts 15, the council that happened there, settled the matter, and by inviting Gentiles to follow the law with those couple stipulations, but that they would be able to follow the law as Gentiles, which is actually why it was important for them not to get circumcised, because then they'd be following the law as Jews, not as Gentiles anymore. But the possibility, and he makes this argument too, the possibility that there's actually allowances within Torah for Gentiles to follow faithfully, that then comes to its fulfillment and fruition through the ministry of Jesus in the Gospels. I mean, that is some like paradigm-busting stuff for someone like me, at least, and probably for a lot of you who are watching this who have similar religious faith tradition backgrounds as I do. And so, gosh, I loved it. It's just opens up so much thought and question and reflection. And I think I'll land this overly long plane flight by saying that both of these books read together really pack a kind of a 1-2 punch of thinking about Torah in an Old Testament Hebraic sense, and then thinking about Jesus in the New Testament Gospels in line with cultivating Torah and what it means then to follow him moving forward. Very powerful stuff for rethinking a lot of the assumptions that we've kind of been given in how to understand the scriptural presentation of some of this stuff. So those are my thoughts on these two really fantastic, awesome new books from Baker Academic from two different authors, Dru Johnson and Paul Sloan. If you hung with me for this whole video, then thank you for watching for an exceptionally long double review on my channel. But as always, thanks for taking some time to watch.